986 AD. 25 ships leave Iceland for Greenland. 14 arrive. 400 people gone, swallowed by the North Atlantic. And yet, every Viking documentary shows the same thing. Long ships smashing through winter storms, ice forming on beards, warriors laughing at blizzards. Here's what doesn't add up. These were the same people who invented the sun compass, who navigated by stars and whale patterns, who built trade routes from Baghdad to Newfoundland. Would a civilization that smart really just ignore the calendar? The answer will change everything you thought you knew about Viking seamanship. They weren't winter warriors. They were something far more impressive. Open any streaming platform, search Vikings, and you'll see it within minutes. Long ships pitching through mountainous waves, ice forming on rigging, the men rowing through howling darkness while sleet cuts horizontal across the frame. The message is clear. Vikings conquered the sea through raw, brutal determination. Winter? They laughed at winter. This image isn't just in fiction. It's seeped into documentaries, history channels, even museum exhibits. The narrative is seductive. These Norse warriors were simply tougher than nature itself. And it makes sense, doesn't it? How else could they have reached Iceland, Greenland, and North America in open boats without engines, without weather forecasts, without rescue services? Surely only men willing to brave the worst conditions could achieve such feats. But here's the problem with this story. The North Atlantic in winter is not difficult. It's impossible. The wave heights in the Norwegian Sea between December and February average 4 to 6 meters, some reaching 14 meters. That's a 4-story building of water crashing onto a vessel with no deck, no shelter, no pumps. Water temperature drops to 4 degrees Celsius. A man overboard has 15 minutes before hypothermia makes swimming impossible. 30 minutes before death. The Vikings knew this. They had a word for the winter sea, Uthaf, the outer ocean. And the sagas are remarkably consistent about one thing. You don't sail the Uthaf unless you have no choice. So how did the winter warrior myth become so dominant? Partly because summer sailing doesn't look as dramatic on screen. Partly because we've confused Viking toughness with Viking recklessness. And partly because we stopped reading what the Vikings themselves wrote about when they actually sailed. The evidence tells a completely different story. Let's start with the primary sources, the Icelandic sagas. These weren't written by outsiders. They were recorded by descendants of Vikings, preserving oral traditions that stretched back generations. And they're obsessively specific about sailing dates. The Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, records over 400 individual voyages to Iceland. When researchers analyzed the dates mentioned, a pattern emerged that demolishes the winter warrior myth. 83% of recorded departures occurred between late April and early September. The peak month, July. The Grenlandinga saga describes Leif Erikson's voyage to North America. It specifies he left Greenland when summer was well advanced. The saga of Eric the Red mentions sailors waiting for favorable summer winds. The Orkneyinga saga describes a fleet that could not sail until the spring storms had passed. Again and again, the same pattern. The Vikings didn't just prefer summer sailing, they planned their entire year around it. But here's what makes this evidence even more compelling. The Old Norse calendar had specific terms for sailing seasons. Harpa, mid-April to mid-May, marked the beginning of safe sailing. Haustmanudur, mid-September to mid-October, marked the end. The period between was called Misseri, the sailing half of the year. The other half, it had a name too. Skamdegi, the short days. And during Skamdegi, the expectation was clear. you stayed home. This wasn't cowardice. When it was institutionalized wisdom. The sagas even contain warnings about those who ignored the seasons. The Njals saga describes a ship that departed later than was wise and was never seen again. So if the Vikings themselves recorded their sailing as primarily a summer activity, why do we keep showing them in blizzards? Because written records can be dismissed as incomplete. Maybe, skeptics argue, the sagas only recorded the safe voyages. Fine. Let's look at what the sea itself can tell us. In 1962, archaeologists excavating Roskilde Fjord in Denmark made a discovery that would take decades to fully understand. 5 Viking ships, deliberately sunk around 1070 AD to block the harbor from enemy fleets. The Skuldelev ships, as they became known, represent the most complete collection of Viking vessels ever found. Now, when marine archaeologists examined the ship's construction, they found something unexpected in the wood itself. Tree ring analysis revealed the timber was cut in early spring, March and April, when sap was rising and wood was easiest to work. But more importantly, the grain patterns showed the trees had been selected from south-facing slopes where snow melted first. This matters because it tells us about scheduling. Vikings weren't building ships year-round. They were building in early spring, launching in late spring, sailing in summer, returning in autumn, and repairing in winter. The entire shipbuilding calendar was synchronized with sailing seasons. Further evidence came from Hedeby, once the largest Viking trading center in Northern Europe. Archaeologists analyzing harbor sediments found distinct seasonal layers. On summer deposits contained high concentrations of ship-related debris, tar, rope fibers, wood shavings from repairs. Winter deposits, almost none. The harbor wasn't just quieter in winter, it was essentially closed. But the most compelling archaeological evidence comes from the ship's cargo. When the Oseberg ship was excavated in 1904, among the burial goods were wild apples, blueberries, and cress seeds, foods available only in late summer and early autumn. The woman buried there had died during sailing season. The Gokstad ship contained remnants of peacock feathers, a luxury import from as far as Persia. But peacocks molt in late summer. The feathers' condition suggested they'd been acquired fresh, meaning the trade voyage happened in, you guessed it, summer months. And every piece of physical evidence points to the same conclusion. Viking sailing was concentrated in a 6-month window, from April to September. But skeptics might still argue. These were trading and burial ships. What about the raids? Surely warfare demanded year-round aggression. Actually, the raiding evidence is even more definitive. And it comes from the Vikings' victims. And that 10%? Almost all were raids by Vikings who had already overwintered, meaning they'd arrived in summer, established camps, and stayed through the cold months on land. The Frankish Annals of Saint Bertin describe this pattern explicitly. In 851, a Viking force remained through the winter for the first time in England. The chronicler notes this as exceptional, remarkable, because it hadn't happened before. If Vikings were routinely sailing in winter, why would overwintering be newsworthy? The Irish annals tell the same story. The monastery at Clonmacnois recorded Viking arrivals with precision. Summer raids were expected. Winter arrivals were noted as unusual, and usually involved ships that had been caught by early storms and couldn't return home. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from Charlemagne's empire. In 800 AD, the Frankish king ordered the construction of coastal watchtowers and signal fires. The records specify these defenses were to be manned from the calends of March until the autumnal equinox, March to September. Charlemagne's military advisors understood something we've forgotten. You don't need to watch for Vikings in winter. The sea handles that for you. 3 independent sources: saga writers, archaeologists, and un-Viking victims, all pointing to the same conclusion. And yet, the myth persists. Why? Because we confused 2 different things: what Vikings could do versus what Vikings chose to do. Could a Viking ship survive a winter storm? Sometimes, yes. The Skuldelev vessels were engineered to handle rough water. Their flexible clinker construction allowed hulls to twist with waves rather than fight them. A skilled crew in the right ship could survive conditions that would sink rigid Mediterranean vessels. But survival isn't the same as strategy. Here's what the evidence actually reveals. Vikings were seasonal operators running a sophisticated annual calendar. Spring, April, and May was preparation time. Ships were repaired, tar reapplied, provisions gathered, crews assembled. Navigation routes were discussed based on who had sailed them most recently. Early summer, June and July, was prime sailing season. The longest days meant maximum visibility for coastal navigation. The calmest seas meant faster crossings. This was when major expeditions launched. Late summer, August and September, was raiding and trading peak. The harvest was in, monasteries had new wealth, markets were active. Vikings arrived when there was something worth taking. Autumn, October, was the return window. Get home before the storms. Those who lingered risked exactly what happened to Eric the Red's fleet, the sea closing behind them like a door. Winter, November through March, was not idle time. It was different work time. Ships were maintained, weapons forged, alliances negotiated. The sagas are full of winter feasts where next year's expeditions were planned. This wasn't weakness. This was optimization. Consider the math. A Viking merchant sailing from Norway to York in favorable summer conditions might complete the journey in 2 weeks. The same journey in winter, fighting storms, with shorter days for navigation, could take 2 months. But it gets worse. Summer sailing meant arrival in a functional state. Crew healthy, cargo dry, ship intact. Winter arrival meant, if you survived, exhausted men, damaged goods, a vessel needing immediate repair. The Vikings weren't conquering impossible conditions through toughness. They were choosing optimal conditions through intelligence. And that choice explains their success far better than any myth about superhuman endurance. Then if you're seeing Viking strategy in a new light, drop a comment below. Did you grow up believing the winter warrior myth? Where did you first encounter it? I'm genuinely curious how this misconception spread so widely. And if you're finding this deep dive into Viking reality useful, a like helps more people discover it. Now, let's address the obvious question. You might be thinking, but Vikings did reach Greenland. They did cross to North America. Those waters are freezing. Doesn't that require winter sailing? Fair question. Let's look at the actual routes. The crossing from Norway to Iceland covers roughly 1,000 kilometers. In summer, with favorable winds, this took about 4 to 7 days. Vikings didn't need to brave winter storms because the distance didn't require it. The hop from Iceland to Greenland, another 450 kilometers. 2 to 4 days in good conditions. Greenland to Newfoundland, roughly 1,800 kilometers following the coast, the longest leg. Still achievable in 1 to 2 weeks of summer sailing with island stops along the way. Here's what the documentaries miss. These weren't non-stop winter odysseys. They were island-hopping summer expeditions with emergency protocols built in. The Hauksbok manuscript describes the standard Greenland route. Sail west from Iceland, keep the Faroe Islands visible to port. Watch for specific bird species that indicate proximity to Greenland's coast. If fog descends, stop, anchor, wait. Patience was part of the navigation system. The Greenland colonies themselves prove this point. When archaeologists excavated the eastern settlement farms, they found extensive provision storage, dried fish, cheese, grain. Why stockpile 6 months of food if you could sail for supplies anytime? Because you couldn't. The settlement survived on summer supply ships and winter self-sufficiency. The collapse of the Greenland colonies in the 15th century reinforces this. As the Little Ice Age extended winter conditions into former sailing months, the supply window shrank. When summer sailing became uncertain, the colonies starved. They didn't adapt to winter sailing. They couldn't. And what about those dramatic sagas of ships caught in storms? They exist, but read them carefully. They're almost always stories of voyages gone wrong, ships that left too late, crews that pushed their luck. The saga of Bjarni Herjolfsson describes him blown off course in fog and storm, and presents this as a cautionary tale, not a how-to guide. One of the exceptions proved the rule. Vikings sailing in dangerous conditions were Vikings in trouble, not Vikings following standard operating procedure. So what does this revision mean for how we understand Viking civilization? Everything, actually. The seasonal sailing model explains patterns that the winter warrior myth cannot. Why did Viking raids target specific months? Because raiders had to arrive after planting their own crops and return before harvest. The raiding season was constrained by the farming season. Why did Viking trade routes follow predictable schedules? Because merchants in Constantinople, Baghdad, and Dublin knew when to expect Norse ships. Trade requires reliability. Reliability requires sailing when conditions permit. Why did Viking expansion happen in bursts rather than continuous flow? Because each new settlement required multiple summer supply runs before it could sustain winter independence. Greenland wasn't colonized in a year. It was built over decades of seasonal shipping. The myth of the winter warrior makes Vikings seem superhuman. The reality makes them something more impressive, systematic. They didn't conquer the North Atlantic through raw courage. They conquered it through calendars. They studied wind patterns across generations. They tracked ice flows by the tales of returning sailors. They built flexibility into their ships and their plans. When the sea said no, they listened. Modern sailors still use the Old Norse sailing season. The cruising window for North Atlantic crossings runs from May to September, exactly matching the Viking Misseri. Last, we've added diesel engines and GPS and satellite weather forecasting. We haven't added a single month to the safe sailing season. 1,000 years later, the ocean still keeps the same calendar the Vikings learned to read. There's a memorial in Reykjavik harbor, a steel sculpture of a Viking ship gleaming against the North Atlantic sky. Tourists photograph it year-round. In July, with the midnight sun reflecting off calm waters. In January, with snow piling on its stylized prow and waves crashing against the seawall behind it. The winter photos look more dramatic, more Viking. But the Vikings themselves would have looked at that January scene and seen something very clear. A ship that's not going anywhere. A sea that's not taking passengers. A season for staying home, sharpening axes, and telling stories by the fire about what summer will bring. They weren't afraid of winter. They simply understood it. And in that understanding, that patience, that strategic acceptance of nature's boundaries, lies the real genius of Norse seamanship. Not warriors who conquered impossible seas. Farmers, traders, and explorers who knew exactly which seas were possible and when. The calendar was their first navigation tool. Everything else came after. Next week, we're exploring another misconception: the real Viking diet at sea. Spoiler, it wasn't just dried fish and hardtack. The preserved foods they carried reveal a level of nutritional planning that surprised modern researchers. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And in the comments, I'm curious, what other Viking myths have you suspected might be Hollywood invention? Your questions often become future videos. Until then, fair winds and following seas, when the season permits.